back, everyone, and good morning, good evening, and good afternoon. I'm not sure where you're at, but here we're going to build a twisted Daytona shelf. So keep in mind, I'm not an engineer, but your cars might lift off the ground here. Here are a couple other items that we're going to use to start off the road, and shown now are a couple shelves that you can get from IKEA. So let's start off by sanding the base of the shelf and prep to glue the road on. Usually my other dioramas, I just use the shelf as the road, but since we're twisting one end, we have to secure one end flat, and the other end is going to be glued to a triangle. Any wood glue will work here, just as long as you secure it and it cures and dries. You just have to ensure that you have a secure, strong bond here. You don't want anything lifting off in the future. Once your glue is applied, lay a road over it and clamp it down. Don't release those clamps until it's secure. Now we have our triangle section, and we're going to rough up both ends on it and apply glue. Same with the shelf and the bottom of the road. That way we're ensuring a secure bond here. This triangle piece is what's going to give our road the twist. So essentially, if you add more of a degree, you're going to have more of a twist, resulting in your tires of your cars coming off the road more severely. If you lessen the degree, you're going to have less warpage in the road, and then it won't look as much twisty. Because we're adding so much warpage to the road, it's pretty much essential to secure with some screws, and you got to do this from both ends. I use two pieces of 16th inch particle board for the walls, and there's an inner and outer wall. I guess what I'm trying to replicate here is the safer wall barrier, or safer barrier. So here you can see I'm adding a block, and this is going behind the outer visible wall, and this is going to keep the wall 90 degrees. And I'm going to leave this there so that wall never comes out. You see that I'm constantly screwing and gluing everything, and this is to help ensure that nothing ever comes out, because again, everything's warped here and twisted. Wherever possible, I try to use clamps to ensure everything cures at the proper degree. Behind this wall, I added posts with screws to help keep the angle. And here you see I'm just wiping away excess glue. So those are the screws I just mentioned. Again, they're there to just keep the wall held at the proper degree that I need it at. To keep it as realistic as possible, I kept the wall at a 90-degree angle following the road the whole time. To replicate the safer barrier, I just used some cheap balsa wood, and I evenly spaced them out at my desired height. And I cut a bunch of pieces out and glued them accordingly. White glue or CA can be used to hold these wooden spacers from the inner and outer wall. To cut the outer wall, I taped it to another piece of wood. That way it wouldn't split apart when I was cutting it. This is essential, otherwise, as you see, the blocks that I installed earlier to keep the wall square wouldn't be able to fit in there. Nobody will ever see the outer wall. It's just there to seal up the upper safer barrier, but it's installed anyway. The front lip where the road meets the edge is going to be grass in the future, so I use some glue and wood chips to fill this area in, and then just rough it up with some sandpaper. I use 60 and 100 grit to do this process. I then sanded down the walls and then puttied any exposed areas. Next, I spray the inner part of the safer barrier wall, and I do this with black acrylic paint. And it's just to add depth, because next I'll be painting it white and you won't be able to do this in the future. So if anybody ever looks down there, there's a little bit of depth. And And as I just mentioned, now we're going to spray the white, and this is going to cover the entire wall, top and sides. Once the wall is completely covered in white, grab some masking tape and cover it, because now we're going to paint the road. And to paint the road, we're just going to use some primer gray. Once the road is painted, use some 100 grit sandpaper to rough it up. Once you're satisfied with your road, mark out where you're going to put your white lines and your yellow lines. After you mark everything out, carefully mask everything. I use yellow frog tape. I cut it up, or you can use Tamiya. It's pretty much identical. Once everything is masked, then I paint the road primer again, and this is to just help runs. You'll see in the future that in this process it didn't really work too well because I think the white was too wet, but it just helps. So once you have all your white roads marked, then do your yellow roads, and then spray everything gray primer the same color as your road, and this is just creating a barrier. Once your gray is thoroughly dry, grab your white acrylic paint, and this is going to be your white center lines. After you get a few coats in, just keep layering it up lightly. Then I switch over the yellow to do the sidewall marker lines. I think they're called sidewall marker lines. Anyway, layer it up lightly as well. Once they're dry, carefully peel the masking tape away. As you see, I have a couple runs here and there, and that's easily fixed with a little bit of water or isopropyl alcohol. The yellow turned out perfect, but the white needs some touching up, and that's what I'm doing here. I will be weathering the road lightly, so this isn't crucial. Next, I use some black acrylic paint to use some tar lines. I was going to use smaller cars for this diorama, like 1/64 Hot Wheels, and then decided to go bigger, so you'll see in the future I actually made those oil lines thicker. So here you see a 1/5, 1/8 paint to thinner wash, and this is just lightly adding up and darkening the road. Once you're satisfied with the color of your road, just dull coat it. Next, I applied a vinyl cutout, and I use this as a stencil. One mistake I did make is I didn't spray white first. Once the stencil was laid, I burred all the edges in and just painted it black right away. I should have created a barrier and sprayed white. On this stencil, it turned out okay, but on the bigger stencil where it says Daytona in full, it peeled off one or two of the letters a little bit, so I turned this into a crash area or crash scene, as you'll see coming up. Once the paint is dried, carefully peel away your mask and reveal your stencil of your Daytona or your favorite track. Always try to peel towards the paint rather than up. Always just try to peel at a 90-degree angle if you can. As mentioned earlier, a couple of mats were ruined on the Daytona, so I used a NASCAR wheel dipped in some acrylic paint to get a good circular pattern. I did this sporadically, but only in 2 or 3 spots. Next, I used black acrylic paint to spread out, I guess, the wheel impacts. And what you're trying to do is make it look like a streak approaching. So I varied between aluminum and black, going back and forth, creating dry brush streaks, again to make it look like impacts. I went back and forth probably 5 or 6 times repeating this process. I tried to avoid using colors in this area and keep to only silver and black and the two slightly mixed together. That way it looks like metal impacting the wall. You could add some color, but I avoided color, like I said. Next, on to the backdrop. And I just simply made this by cutting out some foam board. My diorama height is only about 6 or 7 inches, so because it's also on an angle, my backdrop reflects this, as one side is only 2 inches high and the other side is 4.5 inches high. Here you see I traced out the line of the wall, and now I'm adding about an inch, sketching it below, and then cutting out that line, and this is going to be the total backdrop. I cut out the back pieces to the backdrop so it fits around the screws. I went online and found some night pictures of Daytona, and I thought it would look good as the backdrop for this. Once the paper was all cut out, I just added some white glue to the foam board and then carefully laid the backdrop to the foam board and on the glue. I let it overhang a bit, that way I could fold it over and tape it in the future, and it just helps secure it. As you see, I just kept adding pieces down the foam board until the backdrop was complete, trying to line up the clouds and kind of some pieces so it didn't look too out of whack. Here I added the glue to the back of the backdrop and then folded it over and taped it just to secure the back to ensure that the backdrop doesn't come apart in the future. Next, I got some green paint and I just used some Tamiya part green. I painted the front edge green. I purposely left some gaps earlier, and these gaps are going to be tire marks and mud in the future. There's just a couple of them. This green ended up being way too bright, so I ended up putting some green flocking or green static grass that you'll see coming up. Any overruns, I just cleaned with some thinner. And before I carried on to the next step, I made sure everything was clean. Here I just applied in about 5-6 inch sections some white glue, and then I add this static flocking, and it's just battlefield grass. Once the grass is added, I tap it down lightly, and again work in small sections. Once your section is complete, turn your diorama over and tap over the excess grass. This grass will also start standing upwards by tapping it upside down like that. It's a nice effect. Alternatively, you could use a static grass applicator, but I don't have one at this time. You don't want to spend too much time on the small details on the diorama, as you're aiming to show off the cars, not really the diorama. You're just trying to improve a shelf, that's all. As mentioned earlier, I'm adding some dark brown acrylic paint now, and this will be followed by some light brown acrylic paint on the edges, and then some tan, which is not shown, but the tan is just basically dry brush on the edges to make it look like dry grass. These are just to look like some simulated tire marks and mud, just so the grass isn't absolutely perfect. Next, I'm going to take the backdrop we made earlier and equally mark where we're going to put the fence posts on it. Once the fence post lines are marked, we're going to use this as a template and mark this backdrop on a piece of wood. And then we're going to tape down our brass pieces to make our fence. To have all the tops of the fence posts bent equally, I just made a jig using 4 screws, and the dotted line is where I bend each brass piece equally each time. I just put my finger on the furthest screw, and that's the pivot point that I want to keep the posts at. You could also use a brass tube to hold your brass rod inside instead of 4 screws. So here you can see I drew the template on a piece of wood, and now I'm taping on all the fence posts. I go to the side of the fence posts and make sure all the pivot points where they start angling up are lined up. Now I take some scrap brass rod and I started soldering all the bottom pieces together. All these pieces I'm soldering right now are below the wall, so they're not going to be visible. They're there for support and strength. Once the bottom of the fence is soldered, start working on the top of the fence. And keep in mind the top of the fence is going to be exposed, so use the minimal amounts of solder possible. Next, I want to simulate what would look like barbed wire, but it's more catch fence wire. So what I did is I took 18 gauge wire and stripped the cover off, exposing just the individual wires. Once that was done, I started on the bottom. I wrapped the individual wire around the end fence post, and then individually wrapped each fence post all along the way down the fence. Once I was happy with the appropriate height and the proper spacing, I lightly soldered each lower fence post. On the first layer of wire, I noticed, I did the whole fence, but I noticed it was easier as I did the next two levels. That it's easy just to do 2 fence posts at a time, solder them, and then continue on. Then you can gauge your spacing and form your wiring however you want them to form, soldering along the way. It's a pretty solid process. The fencing is pretty durable. Next, we go on to the fencing. That I just use Veil as I do in every one of my other videos. It's super cheap. I overcut it, as you see here. I tape down the fence, and then I tape down, I guess, the fence posts above it. Here you see I put the CA on the brass, and for some reason I noticed when you put the CA on the brass first, and then you'll see I apply instant set, it doesn't blotch all over the fencing. I hold it only for a couple seconds and it's pretty much set. And then I follow this process all the way down the fence. I try to aim at only doing the bottom and top first. Once all the bottom pieces are secured, secure the other end and then start working on the top. Since the top posts are exposed, you want to be very careful gluing the top, and you want to get most of the top glued. In order to do this, I kept placing clamps along the top bar and then placing glue and the Insta-Set as needed. Once you have the bottom of the net secure, cut it out. And the bottom doesn't have to be as precise because it's going to be hidden under the wall. So you can roughly cut it out. But when you get to the top, make sure your blade is pointing down or angle it away from the fence. That way you're not cutting it short. As you can see here, I took my time around the barbed wire or the catch wire. Once all the top fencing was cut out pretty accurately, I then slowly clamped it and glued it all along the way. That way it was properly secured and there was nothing hanging off and dangling around. And once the netting was fully secured in, I just trimmed off all the excess pieces with the scissors and knife. Once the fencing and posts were dry, I prepped it for paint. And what I did is I got some masking tape to elevate it off the surface so the paint wouldn't essentially glue the fencing to my cardboard there. And here I just used gray primer, same color as the road, except this isn't going to be weathered, so it's going to stay the color of gray you see. I do both sides, that way if anybody does look up at your fencing, it's thoroughly grayed and covered, and it doesn't hurt to do both sides. Keep the coats light, that way you're not flooding the fencing. And finally, to finish off the diorama, I take some 100 grit sandpaper and sand off the front edge where any glue or particles might have attached earlier. And once I have that front edge smooth, I take some normal plain cheap black acrylic paint and I edge up right to the grass edge first, and then once I establish a nice border from the grass, then I swipe or I get more paint and swipe sideways and kind of remove all the brush strokes. And that completes our twisted Daytona diorama. When I initially designed this, I wanted to make it look like the cars were coming out of a turn, and I think I succeeded in that. I really like how it turned out. The fencing and backdrop aren't really installed, they're just resting in the back. That way it makes it easier to install from your shelving and just take it in and out. So hopefully I gave you guys some ideas on how to build a diorama or fencing or backdrop or all together. If you guys enjoyed what you saw, please like and subscribe. And thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.